But before I start, I was just wondering, when we were talking about what I talk about this evening, one of the first questions I asked was, what's the level of understanding of market-based instruments? And just looking across the room, I know that there are some people involved in actually implementing market-based instruments at the moment, which is great. So that'll make for a really good discussion afterwards. But for everybody else in the room, I'm sorry that I don't know quite a few of you. But what's anybody like in terms of who knows what a market-based instrument is? Great. What about have you ever been involved in implementing a market-based instrument? Fantastic. Okay, so that's good. So that's really good, because what I'd like to get out of this for my 20 minutes is really give what I think will be a sort of middle pitch discussion of what a market-based instrument is, give some examples of how market-based instruments are being used in Melbourne, in particular focusing on urban catchments, because that's where I'm currently doing work. And we've got a couple of people here this evening who are working on some of those projects. And then I also want to talk a little bit, just to sort of set up the conversation for what Michelle's going to show next from the work in DEFI in terms of thinking about some design principles around market-based instruments. So really kind of what the evidence shows based on Australian and international experience works and doesn't work in market-based instruments. And I think that's kind of, and then hopefully that will lead to a discussion later on based on other people's experience of what they've found worked and really lessons from the field. So hopefully at the end of my 20 minutes you'll come out having a good understanding of what market-based instruments are, how they're currently being used in Australia, in particular in Melbourne. And when pointy head economists like me start talking about market-based instruments, you'll actually be like, this isn't tough. The first and most important thing about market-based instruments is that they're common sense, okay? And as an intuitive example, this is a market-based instrument for a conservation option. Okay? Essentially, this is eBay. By the way, this is still for sale if anybody's interested. Is it yours? No, unfortunately. But I realise I should probably pick up every other one time. Yeah. But anyway, it's $100. It's going cheap. It is cheap. And there's still 4 days on the clock. But this is a market-based instrument for a conservation option. Because when somebody installs this, what's going to happen is that they're going to capture stormwater, or what has potential to be stormwater, which is going to prevent it going into waterways, which is going to prevent it from degrading, receiving waters, etc., which is going to lead to beneficial outcomes for the community. It's a market-based instrument in the sense that it's an auction, and an auction, market-based instruments are all about a market. As we economists define them, is simply a framework or a mechanism by which one or more parties can come together for the means of exchange. And the key thing about the market is that exchange is mutually beneficial to both parties. Okay? So eBay is a market. We buy and sell things on eBay, and we do it because it's in our interest to do it. A lot of what you can understand about eBay, if you think about how eBay is set up, and I'll be interested to hear what you think about this, a lot of rules from eBay, if you apply the eBay rules to the design of market-based instruments for conservation options or NRM, a lot of the principles that you see in eBay underpin good market-based instrument design principles. Would you agree? So using things like reserve prices, whether you reveal the bid, whether you reveal the bid amount, whether you reveal how many people have bid, whether it's a timed auction, how long the timing of the auction is, all of these are sort of design principles that go into the design of market-based instruments. And all of those considerations can affect the performance of the market-based instrument in terms of how many people come into the market to exchange, and also the prices that they're willing to stump up to pay for the good. So, and also probably the other thing is the information that you provide people in the market is really important to framing how they're going to bid. So there are all sorts of design principles. So I'll go on to, so that's sort of an intuitive example. Often think about, and look, I will say this sort of example works better when you're dealing with what I call a homogeneous good. Okay, so if you're dealing with something that's more complex and more heterogeneous, so different, a different type of actions that you can undertake on land holdings, then this sort of mechanism is going to fall apart. But when you're dealing with urban catchments, often the solutions that you're dealing with, as we'll talk about in a second, are actually quite homogeneous. We're talking rainwater tanks, we're talking rain gardens, things that have known interventions, and you can readily, quite easily and quickly calculate what the potential impact is going to be. So that of course is another. But just as an intuitive example to get us started in terms of thinking about what are market-based instruments, eBay is, an eBay option for a tank is a good place to start. Does that make sense? Okay. Jump in if you've got any questions, by the way. Okay, so just a formal definition then of what is a market-based instrument. As I said before, a market really is just a structure that allows people to come together to exchange. And so typically when we think about a market, we think about people buying something for cash and selling some other good or service. Here, when we're dealing with environmental goods and services, what we're often doing is we've got a government or some other party coming forward, and they are looking to purchase environmental goods which are of public benefit. So waterway health, health of the bay, other things. They're willing to purchase those on behalf of us, the society, because they see that it's going to deliver a beneficial outcome. And they're looking to purchase it from somebody, and usually that somebody is going to be somebody like a private landholder. The advantages, I'll talk about the advantages, we can talk about the disadvantages later, but as a good economist, we economists all believe in market-based instruments. Cross our hearts, hope to die. There are a lot of advantages that we see, and those advantages are more pronounced under certain circumstances, which we'll talk about in a second. So, one of the key advantages of market-based instruments is they can allow us to achieve targeted environmental outcomes at lower cost than engineering solutions or policy solutions. And the way that they do that is by opening up opportunities for exchange for trade that otherwise don't exist. So the simple way to think about this is, probably to work through an example, would be, say we have 3 people, and we're all landholders, and then we have some public land sitting out here. Say we want to improve the health of a streamway. 20% of what you can do is sitting on public land. The remainder is sitting on private land. If we undertake actions on private land, on public land, that's going to get us part of the way. But it might be that that's prohibitively costly to do it. It could be cheaper if we can somehow harness or get access to private agents to get them to undertake work on their own private land in order to deliver those environmental outcomes at lower cost. So what we try to do is we try to set up a mechanism for exchange where we can signal that we, as the government or water retailer or whoever, wants the private party to exchange with us, we'll usually exchange cash or some other sort of support in return for actions on private land that delivers a certain outcome. So what we're really looking for is opportunities where we can enter into that exchange, where it's cheaper for us to go through the exchange than it is for us to do it on public land. The other point is that in some things like catchment, for example, urban catchments, Tim Fletcher and people like that have, I was reading a good paper of his the other day where they were pointing out that with increases in imperviousness, once we start to urbanise, it changes and I'm not a hydrologist, so please whack me over the head after the talk if I get this wrong. But essentially what he's saying is that, what the paper was saying is that, we'll have increased runoff, but we'll also have increased frequency of runoff, and that increased frequency of runoff can be really detrimental because it sort of changes the flow regime quite rapidly. So I've got people nodding, which is good. So I've managed to get that across sufficiently. So I guess what I'm saying, the point is, in some situations, even marginal changes in imperviousness can have big impacts on receiving waters. And so, even if we get 100% success on public land in terms of disconnection, if we haven't done it on private land as well, we're kind of, I wouldn't say wasting our time, but we're not realising the outcomes that we're potentially looking to realise. So that's the main the main gain is what economists call, it allows us to get gains from trade. Does that make sense? Before I step into a couple of examples. No questions? Okay. So there are a couple of examples that, and there are people for the Little Stringy Bark Creek. There are people in the room who are much better equipped to talk about that example than I am because they are involved in it. So I'll probably leave some of that discussion until afterwards. And there's also other projects going on. For example, the Rural Land Program is currently doing a market-based instrument pilot, which some guys at RMCG are working on. So hopefully you guys will be able to talk a little bit about that experience afterwards as well. The key point here is though that there is work going on in looking at using market-based instruments in Melbourne to achieve catchment outcomes and waterway health outcomes. Little Stringy Bark Creek is one of the path-breaking studies. I won't go into that example too much, other than to say that it was a trial of a phased trial of a market-based instrument. The issue that they were facing there is essentially stormwater, too much stormwater due to imperviousness. We wanted to disconnect the creek, and they were essentially investigating different ways and different types of market-based instruments to see whether that disconnection could be achieved through market-based instruments. I think they used about 3 types. And this is sort of where you start getting into the technical part that they used. I think they used what's called a uniform option, a uniform price option. And I think you also used an ascending price option in that. And then also at the end, they used a direct action funding approach. I'll talk more about what a uniform price option is in a second. Main point there is that there are some really good lessons that were learned out of the Stringy Bark example, and the fact that they tried different option mechanisms was also quite quite a good advancement for understanding how MBIs will perform best in urban catchments. I think probably one of the lessons that came out of that from everybody that I've spoken to on those projects is the trade-off between complexity and efficiency. So, as economists, we always go after the idea of efficiency, but and there are auction designs that suggest that you should be able to get more efficient outcomes. And what I mean by more efficient outcomes is that you should be able to get people to reveal what they are actually willing to pay for that tank by using certain types of auction or tender designs. So there are certain types of tender designs that suggest that you should be able to get that sort of willingness to accept price relevation better than if you use other mechanisms. But often trying to employ those mechanisms comes at a cost of complexity, and that results in people potentially backing out of the market because they just say, I don't understand, this is just too difficult for me. So you lose market participation at the gain of efficiency. So it's probably one of the key lessons that I think came out of that experience. One of the projects that I'm currently working with Melbourne Water and a couple of other agencies is pretty much an advisory role is in Dobson's Creek. This project has been going for a couple of months. We're really in the design phase at the moment. Very much a similar sort of issue that we're facing here. We're looking at disconnecting the creek. There's a large amount of area that's on private land where it's a pilot, so we're really looking at seeing how we can design an option or a tender mechanism that allows us to go out and recruit people who are private landowners to do things like install tanks in their property, and really to see whether they will be willing to share some of the cost of installing rainwater tanks. So, our two objectives here is to get as much uptake as we possibly can, but also to see whether we can, instead of Melbourne Water paying for the full tank and the installation, to see whether to devise a mechanism where people will actually contribute towards having that rainwater tank mechanism put in place in their property. So in terms of the work that we're doing there, at the moment, and we can talk about it in more detail afterwards, at the moment we're doing probably what you could call a market segmentation analysis. So there's already been a first phase of Dawson's where people were given free tanks. That reduces the number of people that potentially are going to be interested in it. But what we're doing, or what Melbourne Water is doing at the moment, is going out and understanding really the drivers behind why people took up the tank offer the first time, what were the driving motivations behind it, and also for people who didn't participate last time, what were things that sort of prevented them or inhibited them from participating. And that understanding is important, because one of the first things that you need to do when you design a market-based instrument is understand what as economists call what the market failure is. What's the underlying reason why this has been happening anyway? And what we're finding is that there are really two sort of clusters of potential users. One is the sort of customer who's really interested in the benefits that they can get from the rainwater tank in terms of how it could reduce their water bills or keep their gardens green. And then there's another cluster of potential tank or people who would be potentially interested in participating in this market, who are really concerned about the outcomes and the condition of the creek. And so essentially what that suggests in terms of the design mechanism is that when you're communicating or when you're setting up the market-based instrument, you've really got to communicate two different messages to get to two different types of people to enter into the market. So that's a nice level of sophistication, because often with NBOs you see sort of a blanket approach with just almost an assumption that build it and they will come, because we're offering this and it's a market, and it's going to improve outcomes. People automatically want to come forward, and the reality of the case is that that's not the case. Really, a lot of good market-based instrument design really relies on understanding your customer and being able to develop a marketing message that makes them believe and make them see the benefit for themselves, whether that benefit is tied to a public benefit, which they want the public to have, or their own private benefit. So, another example that we're working on at the moment is, there's this sort of demarcation a lot of the time. People talk about market-based instruments. We automatically think about auctions and tenders, but offsets are also market-based instruments, because again, if we go back to that definition of what a market is two people creating a framework to allow them to exchange. So an offset, everybody know what an offset is? It's basically, let's say it's an urban water provider who has a recycled water plant, and they're releasing water in the mixing zone that the EPA says you've got to bring down the mixing zone. And they look at what they could do in a recycled water plant, and it's kind of like, well, that's $10 million to do. Is there some other way that we can achieve that outcome? And the other way that we could achieve that outcome, or delay having to make that large capital investment, could be to do something like riparian vegetation or in-stream wetlands or more environmental flows. And essentially they're saying the offset becomes, can we achieve this outcome by doing something else? And often that something else involves you potentially purchasing something from a third party. So for example, it could be that you have to contract with people upstream to put in riparian veg. That is a market-based instrument. So we're currently working with the Council of Melbourne to, the situation is slightly reversed. What they're wanting to do is they're wanting to capture economies of scale in stormwater assets. And they want to set up an offset scheme so that they can essentially fund that, so people who are doing developments or changing imperviousness area on properties can essentially go in, and instead of having to do the mitigating works on their property, they can effectively just buy an offset from the council as a provider and offset it in that way. So we're looking at design principles around that. And we can talk about all of those examples later on. How am I doing for time? Sorry, I usually get lost.
Not too bad. That harmful.
Okay, cool. So this is from string. This is an example from the stringy bark, and really, sorry, as an economist, I have to put up a graph. Otherwise, we feel bad by the end of the evening. But I think you also have a very similar graph, which I thought was funny. But essentially, this just sort of, and I promise this will be the only graph that we'll show. So this is out of that paper that I was talking about earlier on by Tim Fletcher. Toby Prosser was also an author of Veronica Nems, Andrew Lenoz, and a couple of other people who I apologise for forgotten. It's a nice, if you want to have a nice little applied reading, this is a nice little paper. It talks about the stringy bark example. It's the first, it was the first instalment of where they ran the uniform price option. But it basically takes you through the background, how they set up how they calculated the environmental benefit unit, and how they ran the auction and what the results of the auction was. So, if you're interested, it's a nice read, and it's a Melbourne-based example, so it's great. So essentially, what we're trying to, so all I wanted to do here was to say, when we come up with when we use a market-based instrument, essentially what happens is we go through a process where we create information to tell people that we want to make an exchange. People then go through some mechanism where they understand what that exchange involves. They then make an offer for that exchange, which is set at some price, and then you'll usually have what's called some measure of environmental benefit. So in the case of water, it's often your standard water quality measure of nitrogen per kilogram, or a combination of a water quality measure and a flow measure, which is what was used here. And the bids that people have submitted will then be converted into a bid per unit of environmental benefit. And so what you can see here, the dotted line in this example is all of the bids per unit of environmental benefit, and this is essentially the cumulative environmental benefit. So what it shows is that this is essentially an individual's bid, and the increment, actually let's use this one, the increment between the quantity and the price, essentially that defines how much they were offering and how much more they asked per unit of environmental benefit compared to the previous person. The blue line is what I was talking about before in that example when I was pointing to the area of public works. The blue line is essentially, this is what you could get from, this is the cost per unit of environmental benefit for undertaking public works in the same catchment. Essentially what you're looking to do in all of these exercises, wherever you're below, and I'll qualify that, in principle, if you can do it, and we'll get into this in a second, if you can understand the risk associated with private versus public provision, which is something that probably hasn't been done all that well in the past, but if you can account for any risk associated with the difference between private and public provision, you're looking to take advantage of all of the lower cost opportunities to achieve that environmental benefit. And essentially, your aim is to do that up until a point where it becomes more cost effective for you to achieve more environmental benefit at a lower cost through public provision. Does that make sense? I promise that'll be the last graph that I show. So, this is the results of an actual auction, showing what they succeeded, and what the threshold was for per unit of environmental benefit achieved. So that's pretty much So that's essentially so. And what we're talking about here is, you remember how earlier on I talked about gains from trade. These are the gains from trade. Through trade, the gains that we're being able to achieve is the same level of environmental outcome at a lower cost. And economists like that, not because we like getting things at the lowest cost, but for me as an environmental economist, the reason that I like that is because it means we can push this out, and it means we can get more environmental benefit for the same level of cost. And when we operate in a budget-constrained environment, that for me is a good thing. Is that all? That's all good? That's all okay? Okay. So let's have a quick chat about what works. So this is really what works based on the evidence from conservation auctions, and also from the water auctions for things like water quality outcomes. It's based on a mix of Australian evidence and international evidence. Look, there are a ton of people working out in this area who are good at what they do, and there's also a bunch, probably 4 or 5 really, really good reports if you ever want to get into this. And if you want afterwards, I'm quite happy to write down a list for you, or just give me your email and I'll flip them to you, because there are some very, very comprehensive reports that allow you to understand what works and what doesn't based on the international literature. So really, a lot of this is really summarising that in a bit of our own experience. So, probably the first point is what works, and even though it's not really, these are, that point I said earlier on about a lot of it is common sense. Some of the fundamental principles that you always want to keep in mind when you're doing this in the real world, unless you're doing a pilot and you're looking to understand sort of what works in terms of different sort of design principles. So you're doing it as an experiment. You want to keep it simple. You want to use common sense in your design. Go back to your eBay principles a lot of the time. A really important thing is you want to build belief and trust in the people who are actually going to be entering into the marketing contracting with you. And the other thing that you want to be focusing on is you want to be thinking about the transaction costs involved in undertaking the market-based mechanism. And so when I talk about transaction costs, it's an economic term that basically means the costs of seeking information, engaging third parties in contracting and then monitoring and enforcing the contract. Okay? And the reason that transaction costs are really important is because transaction costs can be really, really high in market-based instruments. And it's, when we first started talking about market-based instruments a long time ago, we were saying, compared to this regulation, look at the efficiency gains that we can get from this. But I think what we learn through time is that the transaction costs involved with market-based instruments can be very high, and sometimes the gains that we get through exchanges through trade are offset by the transaction costs involved. So always while you're doing this, the test has got to be not whether it's going to be more efficient than the efficiency gains that we get from market, but is it going to net off the efficiency gains plus the transaction costs of doing this? That's if you're doing cost-benefit analysis, that's the calculation you've got to be having in your head when you're comparing it to some other mechanism. So some of the key success factors that you want to be looking for, there are some key signals that you can sit down and look at a situation and kind of come up whether there's going to be, whether you're going to have miles between a market-based instrument versus a non-market-based instrument in terms of outcomes or not. And the first thing that you're looking for, the first thing you always want to look for is the potential for gains for trade. And so there's going to be a potential for gains for trade if somebody's willing to give up something, or if you're willing to pay something versus something, or if the cost of you doing something is a lot different from the cost of somebody else doing it. Okay. That's essentially your fundamental criteria. When you think about the cost, don't just think about the cost of actually implementing it. And rainwater tanks are probably a good example, because rainwater tanks, the cost of rainwater tanks and the cost of achieving environmental benefit, as I said earlier, it's pretty common across properties. So you wouldn't actually think there would be a huge opportunity for gains from trade there. But the gains from trade potentially come from another source in this situation, and that's from people's willingness to do something good for society potentially. Another potential source that we talked about earlier on is the recognition that they're going to potentially save on their water bills. Another potential benefit is that they could be an avid gardener, and so assuming that the tank is going to have enough water in it over the hot period, they might be more willing to pay to capture that surplus than other people. So even in something like a good that you initially look at and think, well, that's a pretty standard good. We're not going to get huge gains from trade because there's not going to be huge differentials in terms of what people are going to be willing to accept. Because the technology is the same, and the cost of installing that technology may well be about the same. There can still be psychological or intrinsic motivations that drive people to have differences in gains from trade. So that really then comes to understanding who the people are that you're going out into the market and what's motivating. The regulatory approaches, other signs that you're going to get benefits is if you look at the cost of regulation, it's going to be much higher. And probably the other point is that if you look at the cost, if you look at the what the end goal looks like in terms of putting in rain tanks or something like that, and you recognise that the costs associated with enforcing the contract, so basically ensuring that people actually keep those tanks in and keep them then used once they've actually purchased them in the property. The cost associated with doing that monitoring and evaluation is quite low compared to the alternative, which could be a public provision of a good. So that's the other sort of test that you want to try and take. Some other, again, common sense things. You want to be able to show writing on the board really quickly. If people have to wait for a couple of years before they see outcomes or before something's implemented, there's going to be, experiences, there's going to be less appetite for uptake. People like things that are going to happen by Christmas. You want community and social support. You can build that community and social support. You have to think about how you go about doing that. And there's also, as I said earlier, there's belief that the NBI is going to be implemented and that it's going to be enforced and monitored. And really creating that belief. If somebody rang you up tonight and said, I'm ringing up from a water company, I want to give you a tank, would you be willing to pay something towards that tank? It's a question of how do you establish that belief and confidence in people that this isn't some sort of prank call or something like that, if that makes sense. Okay, so I'll just jump through these quite quickly. So again, what works? I won't go into market failure too much. We can talk about that afterwards if we want. But it's the first step in all of these things when you're designing an NBI is to think about what's causing the problem. Why isn't this happening without us having to intervene? And that effectively, there's a diagram which we can work through afterwards if we feel like it. But there are some standard ways that you can go through and understand what is causing the market failure, and that then leads you to some design principles about how you might want to set up your NBI to address them. The other thing that, in my experience, you really want to understand at the outset is what is our objective. Is our objective to disconnect the creek and get environmental outcomes, or is our objective to get a cost-effective outcome? So to get people revealing, to implement this at the excuse me, a little bit more white wine. It's the first talk that I've ever been able to have white wine at, so it's nice. Or are we looking to achieve something at lowest unit cost? Because if you think about it, that there's potentially a trade-off between the price of something and how many units that you're going to be able to achieve. Or are we looking to design this as a pilot program so that we can understand what people are willing to accept for, the rainwater tank, so that we can use that price information, that big curve that we showed earlier on, to construct a longer term and longer program based on having a really accurate understanding of what people are willing to pay for this type of program. But it means that we don't have to implement the NBI. So the issue here is that often these can be conflicting objectives. So you need to be clear at the outset what your objective is. Why are we doing this? You also want to, at the outset, when you're diagnosing it, you want to do that gut feel test of, do we really think this is going to give us superior outcomes? And really, you can figure that out within about an hour of sitting down and understanding the problem and understanding how many agents you can potentially go out to, what are the actions they can undertake, and a couple of other key things. Okay, just in the interest of time, I won't go through all of the technical, what I call the technical stuff. All I wanted to say is that when you're designing one of these market-based instruments, you've got a diagnose phase where we say, what is the problem? Based on our understanding of what the issue is, we then design the market-based instrument to meet and address those problems. You can then test the design through a range of means that we can talk about afterwards. You implement it, and then there's a monitoring and evaluation. So the standard sort of project logic. I really do want to say a couple of things. Probably the most important, the most important points is there are a couple of different ways that you can design an option. So there's something called
there's what we call a discriminatory price option or discriminatory price tender. And that basically involves you bidding exactly what you want to pay for the good. Okay? And then there's another type of auction, which is called a uniform price auction. And uniform price auction basically involves people who are successful in their bid paying the price that either the highest bidder said that they were willing to pay, or the first bidder who didn't win said that they were willing to pay. So the fundamental difference between those two things is in a discriminatory bid, you pay what you say you're willing to pay, whereas in a uniform price bid, you potentially pay less than you are actually willing to pay. There are advantages of you use uniform price auctions in certain situations, and you use discriminatory price auctions in other situations. But probably the main point here is that the international literature shows that discriminating and uniform price options often, for conservation options anyway, often yield very similar efficiency outcomes. So, at risk of any economists in the room throwing a pen at me, I'd say don't worry too much about whether you're going to use a discriminatory or uniform price auction. Figure out which one's going to work best in terms of what your objective is for the auction, and then decide on that basis. And we can talk more about when you want to use discriminatory versus uniform afterwards. There are other things around. Again, go back to the eBay example. There are other things to think about. So, how long do we run the auction for? You know, do we run over a month? Do we run over a week? Do we have a single round auction where you put in your best and final bid, or do we have a multiple round auction where we have maybe your first bid, and then we have a recourse to be able to go back and say, there are lots of people in front of you in the line. They're going to get in. You're not. Do you want to bid? Do you want to bid again? You know, do you want to make a better offer? There are some design principles around that, but effectively, what the literature and experience shows is that most of your efficiency gains you'll get within about two rounds of an auction. So, 2 rounds a single or double is generally good enough. Reserve prices. Again, go back to eBay. Reserve prices are when you set a minimum or a maximum price where there is actually no auction until you hit that reserve price. Exactly the same as if you go into an auction for a house. If you're setting up an auction, the rule is generally use a reserve price, but the special rule is, depending on what your objective is, whether you actually reveal what that reserve price is or not. And generally, our advice, or my advice, would be if you're looking to get an accurate willingness to pay or a willingness to accept bid from somebody, what you want to do is you want to tell people that there is a reserve price, but you don't want to tell them what the reserve price is. And the reason for that is it creates an anchoring effect to that price. And again, we can talk about that more if you want afterwards. Gosh, there's a whole bunch of other things that maybe we'll come back to this slide if you don't cover a lot of it off, because it is getting a little bit technical and running out of time. So there's a bunch of technical stuff, but there's also really importantly the actual going out to market stuff. And I think a lot of the time this this part of MDIs has been, for conservation tenders and auctions, has actually been underdone. You know, if you're doing this sort of thing, you really want to think about who your customer is and what's going to draw them into the market and what's going to encourage them to want to participate. And again, we can talk about some examples and some ideas of the ways that could be done. Essentially, what you want to be doing is, you want to be stimulating the market to get people to come into the market. You want to be creating confidence and belief that this is actually going to happen. That you're not bidding on something that isn't going to eventuate. And there's a whole bunch of literature, in particular around non-market valuation, that talks about how you can design questionnaires and surveys and give people information to make decisions, what we call in non-market valuation literature, incentive compatible. That is, people believe that it's going to happen, and as a result of their belief that it's going to happen, they reveal a more accurate price signal than they would if they don't actually believe that it's going to happen. Okay, so back to the rainwater tank. So all I wanted to do with this, going back to the rainwater tank, is say, think about what I've just run through really, really quickly and some of the design principles, and you'll see a lot of this is really embedded already within an eBay type structure. You know, reserve prices, time clocks, single round, discriminatory price. This is a single unit auction. All of those things are already in an eBay. So, you know, sometimes when you're thinking about these things, go to eBay and just sort of say, how does it say here? A lot of the principles are the same. It's not rocket science. There's a lot of good evidence out there. The other thing that I threw in is that you've got to, when you're designing these things, you want to be very complete and make sure that you've addressed all of the things in people's heads that they're possibly going to think about. So, you know, if we were running this as a conservation auction on eBay, people might think, well, what does a tank normally cost? Who's paying for the pump? Do I need to order my guttering? Do I need to have a slab put in? Filtration systems? How much am I going to? There are a whole bunch of other questions that you want to think about in terms of your design. The more you can close down and answer those questions and give people clarity around all of those aspects. You know, the tank's going to be put in. You know, the auction's going to happen next week. The tank's going to go in by Christmas. It's going to be put in by a local plumber whose name is such and such. You know, you can look him up on him or her up on the pages. Creating that certainty is really critical because it creates belief and it creates participation. Okay. Again, there's a lot of good literature on how that can happen. I'll leave it there. I've got my contact details here. As I said, there are lots of people doing really interesting work. There are quite a few people in the room, so we'll have a discussion afterwards.